In the frozen heart of Montana's wilderness, a tiny bobcat cub fought for life against an enemy it could never outrun, until fate intervened with a twist no one could have predicted. What began as a brutal attack by a starving wolf pack turned into a bond so fierce, so unexpected, it would change two lives forever. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about how the smallest heartbeat can awaken the deepest scars, and maybe, just maybe, heal them. Stick with us until the end, because you won't want to miss how loyalty, love, and a second chance can rewrite destiny. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video and tell us in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? The wind howled like a living thing through the mountains, bending the skeletal pines and carving deep trenches into the endless white. Somewhere in that sea of snow, a tiny bobcat cub named Ash stumbled forward, each step slower than the last. His paws, too small for the cruel winter, sank into the frozen ground with every labored movement. He had been separated from his mother days ago when the blizzard struck, a storm so fierce it seemed to erase the world itself. Now, alone, starved, and half-frozen, Ash dragged himself through the blinding whiteness, a fragile heartbeat fighting against a silence that had already claimed so much. Ash didn't see the clearing ahead. He barely registered the smell. Musky, sharp, the scent of predators lurking nearby. His instincts, dulled by exhaustion, didn't scream until it was too late. The wolves emerged from the treeline like shadows, their fur matted with ice, eyes burning with hunger. They didn't attack right away. They circled him first, a slow, cruel dance, savoring the moment. A low growl rumbled from the throat of the largest one, a signal that the hunt, short and merciless, was about to end. Ash tried to stand tall. He tried to hiss, to fight, to make himself bigger. But he was a cub, helpless against the brutal reality of nature's cold laws. His legs gave out, collapsing him into the snow. In that moment, the world held its breath. One of the wolves lunged, jaws wide, and then, out of nowhere, a single gunshot shattered the frozen stillness. The sound exploded through the clearing, sending the wolves scattering in a panic. Their yelps echoed as they melted back into the trees, leaving behind only churned snow and the quivering form of the bobcat cub. Ash lay frozen in place, too weak to flee, too shocked to understand why death had passed him by once again. His tiny chest heaved with shallow breaths, each one a fragile tether to life. Somewhere beyond the trees, heavy boots crunched against the snow, growing closer. Ash's vision blurred, blending man and forest into one dizzying smear. He didn't know if the new presence meant salvation or another threat. All he knew was that the snow was colder now, biting into his skin, and that whatever came next would decide whether his story ended here or if fate had other plans. The figure knelt beside him. A rough, worn hand reached out, hesitating for just a moment before wrapping the little bobcat in warmth. Ash's body tensed, but he no longer had the strength to resist. As the stranger lifted him from the ice, cradling him against a thick, familiar-smelling jacket, the cub's world faded into darkness, carried not by the storm this time, but by something softer, something human. And just like that, in the middle of nowhere, against a sky still raging with snow, two broken souls crossed paths. A man clinging to memories and a cub clinging to life, both unaware that this chance meeting would change everything. Luke Harrison hadn't meant to fire that shot. Not at first. His instinct, the one honed from decades of ranger duty, had twitched the moment he spotted the wolves closing in. It wasn't just the cub's cries that stirred him. It was something older, something raw, buried deep beneath the weathered layers of a man who had lost too much and trusted too little. As he trudged toward the crumpled figure in the snow, rifle slung over one shoulder, Luke's gut clenched the way it had once clenched at a roadside crash so many winters ago. Back then, he had been too late. This time, he wasn't going to let history repeat itself. The little bobcat was barely breathing when Luke knelt beside him. Up close, the cub was an even more pitiful sight. Blood streaked through his patchy fur, his sides heaving with shallow gasps. Luke hesitated, his calloused hand hovering above the tiny body. Logic screamed to leave the wild to the wild. Let nature do what it would. But logic had no place here. Something deeper, something painful and stubborn, moved his hand forward. Carefully, almost reverently, he wrapped Ash in his old, battered military jacket, the same one he hadn't worn since his son's funeral. Carrying Ash back through the snow, Luke could feel how feather-light the cub was, how every tiny shiver rattled through the jacket and straight into his bones. It reminded him of carrying Ethan when he was a baby, swaddled in blankets after falling asleep in the truck, small and trusting in a way only children and animals could be. That memory, so sharp and vivid it almost brought Luke to his knees, propelled him through the blizzard back toward the cabin that had long since stopped feeling like a home. The cabin door creaked open against the wind, and Luke shouldered it shut behind him. Inside, the place was as cold as the world outside. Dust coated every surface. The fireplace sat dormant, unused, the woodpile stacked neatly but untouched. Luke hadn't needed warmth in a long time. He hadn't wanted it. Until now. He moved mechanically, building a fire with numb fingers, every crackle of flame sounding too loud, too alive. He cleared a spot by the hearth, spreading an old quilt he hadn't been able to throw away, even when the memories it carried were almost too much. Gently, he laid Ash down, careful not to jostle him more than necessary. The cub whimpered, a tiny, broken sound that made Luke's chest ache in ways he thought he'd buried forever. Ash was a mess. One leg twisted at an odd angle, his body riddled with shallow bite marks, his ears torn. Luke cleaned the wounds with trembling hands, the old ranger instincts kicking in, but it wasn't technique he relied on now. It was hope. Hope that maybe, if he could keep this little heartbeat alive, he could salvage something he'd lost. Outside, the storm howled louder, rattling the windows and whistling through the cracks. Somewhere out there, the wolves prowled still, their hunger unsated, their presence a shadow hanging over the fragile sanctuary Luke was trying to build. He glanced once at his rifle leaning by the door, then back at the fragile life stretched out before him. For the first time in years, Luke made a silent promise. Not to himself, not to the ghosts that lingered in every corner of this cabin, but to Ash. He didn't know if the cub would survive the night. He didn't know if he had the strength to save him. But he knew one thing with a certainty that rooted itself deep inside his battered soul. He was going to try. Because sometimes the smallest hands or the smallest paws were the ones that pulled you back from the darkest edges. The fire had dulled to a soft glow by the time Luke finally sat back in the old rocking chair, his bones aching more from memories than from age. Across the room, curled up on the patchwork quilt like a battered soldier home from some unseen war, Ash slept. Or at least he tried to. Every few minutes, the cub whimpered in his dreams, tiny paws twitching against invisible enemies. Luke knew that kind of sleep, the kind where your mind tried to run but your body was too broken to follow. Outside, the storm raged on, hammering the cabin with icy fists, as if the world itself was determined to finish what the wolves had started. The wind whistled through the gaps in the windows, carrying strange sounds that made even a man like Luke flinch. He told himself it was just the wind, but deep down something darker stirred. Old ghosts, old guilt. Luke's eyes drifted to the mantel above the fireplace. There, coated in dust, was a photograph. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, beaming with a missing front tooth, standing beside a much younger Luke in a ranger's uniform. They were holding a homemade birdhouse together, proud, unstoppable, invincible in the way only a father and son could be. Ethan, his boy. The storm outside had nothing on the one that raged in Luke's chest every time he looked at that picture. He hadn't meant for any of it to happen. A patch of black ice, a spinning truck, screams swallowed by a blizzard. It was over in seconds, but the aftershocks had lasted a lifetime. Luke had carried Ethan's lifeless body through a night much like this one, blood freezing to his jacket, prayers freezing on his lips. A night when nature had proven just how merciless it could be. And now another storm, another small life slipping through his fingers, unless he fought harder this time. Ash stirred again, letting out a pained mewl. Luke was beside him in an instant, whispering words he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Nonsense words, comfort words, stitched together from the scraps of bedtime stories and campfire songs he used to tell Ethan. The cub pressed closer to the warmth, trusting, needing. Luke's throat tightened so hard it hurt. "You're safe now, little guy," he muttered, running a rough hand gently over Ash's battered fur. "You're not alone." For a moment, the cabin seemed to breathe with him, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see if this fragile alliance between man and beast could survive the night. Somewhere deep in the woods, a wolf howled low, mournful, and far too close. The sound snaked its way under the door, into Luke's bones, a chilling reminder that the danger was far from over. The wolves weren't done. They knew Ash was weak. They knew Luke was alone. And the hunger that drove them wasn't the kind you could reason with. But Luke wasn't the same man who had let the world rip his heart out once without a fight. Not anymore. He stoked the fire higher, fortifying the room with as much heat as he could manage, and sat back down beside Ash, shotgun within reach. His heart hammered in rhythm with the rising wind, each beat a stubborn vow. This time, he would stand his ground. This time, he wouldn't let the storm win. As Luke sat there, half guarding, half remembering, he realized something strange and undeniable. Saving Ash wasn't just about the cub anymore. It was about redemption. It was about healing a wound so deep he had almost stopped feeling it. And as the firelight danced across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed almost to whisper promises of hope, Luke made another silent promise. He wasn't just fighting for Ash's life. He was fighting for his own. The first sign that the wolves hadn't given up was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that wraps you up like a warm blanket, but the sharp, unnatural quiet that prickles the back of your neck. Luke noticed it when the fire popped too loudly, when Ash's breathing seemed to echo across the room. The storm had slowed, but in its place came a stillness that didn't feel like rest. Felt like waiting. Ash stirred, ears twitching, body tensing against some invisible threat. Luke set his coffee mug down slowly, the old instincts snapping back into place like a bear trap. He crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbing the shotgun from its resting place by the door. The wood floors creaked under his boots, each sound loud enough to betray his every move. But it wasn't the noise inside that mattered. It was what lurked beyond the walls. At first, there was nothing, just darkness and the endless groan of the wind against the pines. Then, faintly, the scrape of claws on wood. Luke's blood turned to ice. He moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just an inch, heart hammering a warning. There, under the bone-white light of the rising moon, shapes slithered between the trees. Dark, low to the ground, patient. The wolves had returned. But this wasn't the reckless, desperate charge of starving animals. No, this was something else. Smarter, more deliberate. They had learned from the last encounter. They knew the man inside was dangerous, but they also knew the cub was weak. And wounded prey always drew the boldest predators. Ash whimpered, sensing the danger as surely as Luke did. Luke knelt beside him, running a hand along the little bobcat's back. The cub's muscles were tight as a bowstring, his tiny body trembling from more than just cold. Luke didn't speak. Words were useless now. Survival didn't come from promises. Came from action. He moved quickly, securing the doors and windows, checking every latch, every hinge. He pulled an old oil lantern from a cabinet, lighting it with shaking hands, and set it near the front window to make the cabin glow brighter, more alive. Maybe it would be enough to make the wolves think twice. Maybe. But deep down, Luke knew they weren't dealing with fear anymore. Hunger and desperation made creatures reckless, sure, but it also made them fearless. And in the food chain of the wild, second chances were a myth. Ash let out a soft, strangled cry that tore through Luke like shrapnel. He scooped the cub up carefully, tucking him into an old canvas satchel lined with fleece. The idea of fighting off a pack while protecting Ash felt insane, but leaving the cub alone for even a second felt even worse. Then, a heavy thud at the back of the cabin. Wood creaked under weight it wasn't built to bear. Luke spun, leveling the shotgun toward the door. Another thud. Another. The wolves weren't testing the cabin anymore. They were coming. Luke's mind raced, flipping through old lessons, survival tactics drilled into him over years of work in the wilderness. Fire, light, noise, anything to make himself bigger, louder, more dangerous than the prey the wolves saw him as. He grabbed the box of road flares from the pantry, yanked one free, and struck it against the rough strip on the box. With a fierce hiss, it roared to life, bathing the room in a searing red glow. The thudding stopped. A heartbeat later, snarls echoed from just outside the walls. They were regrouping, reassessing. But Luke knew it was only a matter of time before hunger outweighed caution. He glanced down at Ash, who blinked up at him with dazed, frightened eyes. Luke tightened his grip on the flare. "Not tonight," he muttered under his breath. "Not this time." Because sometimes survival wasn't about strength or numbers. Sometimes it was about stubbornness, about refusing to be the easy meal fate had decided you should be. The wolves wanted a victim. Luke was about to give them a war. The wolves didn't come at once. They were smarter than that. Instead, they surrounded the cabin like a noose slowly tightening, shadows weaving between trees, claws scratching against the walls in a maddening rhythm. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind slithering through the cracks, felt like a countdown Luke couldn't hear but knew was running out. Luke moved fast, fueled by something deeper than adrenaline. A stubborn, raw defiance that came from years of carrying guilt like a second skin. He dragged heavy furniture across the doors, bracing them with the same hands that had once fumbled helplessly at a crushed seatbelt all those years ago. This time, he would not be helpless. Not tonight. Not with Ash counting on him. Ash, barely awake, whimpered from the corner of the room where Luke had tucked him behind a barricade of firewood and blankets. The cub's wide, fearful eyes locked onto Luke's every movement. A silent plea threaded through the space between them. Luke offered a rough smile. Not much, but it was all he had left to give, before lighting another flare and wedging it into the crack of the window frame, casting the cabin in eerie, flickering red. Outside, growls rose like a wicked chorus, growing bolder with every second. One wolf, larger than the rest, prowled close enough for Luke to see its ribs poking out from its fur, hunger sharpening its edges into something more beast than animal. They didn't just want to eat. They needed to. Survival for them was as desperate as it was for Luke and Ash. Another thud rocked the back door. Luke steadied his shotgun against his shoulder, feeling the familiar weight settle his nerves. He wasn't the young, sharp-eyed ranger he once was, but he had one advantage the wolves didn't. He knew what it felt like to have already lost everything. And when you've lost everything, fear has a hard time finding a place to land. The first wolf lunged at a boarded window, snarling, snapping, testing. The wood cracked but held. Another darted toward the front door, only to recoil from the searing light of the flare. For now, the cabin was holding. A fragile sanctuary built on old wood, old regrets, and a brand new promise Luke wasn't ready to break. A memory crashed over him. Ethan, no more than 6, standing by a small campfire in the woods, proudly holding a stick with a marshmallow half burnt to a crisp. "It's not about being perfect, Dad," the boy had said, grinning through soot-smudged cheeks. "It's about not giving up." Back then, Luke had laughed, ruffling Ethan's hair, thinking he had all the time in the world to teach his son the hard lessons. But it turned out Ethan had been the teacher all along. Luke shook the memory away and refocused on the present. Giving up wasn't an option. Ash needed him. Maybe on some battered, blood-stained level, Luke needed Ash too. The wolves closed in again, a synchronized push against the front and back of the cabin. Boards cracked, nails shrieked under pressure. Luke fired a warning shot through the window, the blast lighting up the night like a lightning strike. The wolves scattered, but only for a moment. They regrouped, smarter, meaner, determined. Luke knew he was living on borrowed minutes. Reinforcements weren't coming. There was no cavalry, no dramatic last-second rescue. There was just him, a battered shotgun, a tiny cub clinging to life, and a house built out of stubbornness and memory. But sometimes, when the world backed you into a corner, you didn't fight because you thought you could win. You fought because some things, some lives, were worth standing for, even when the odds said otherwise. And Luke Harrison had never been much for listening to odds. By midnight, the cabin looked like a war zone. The barricades groaned under the weight of relentless assault, and the floorboards vibrated with the growl of claws scraping just beyond the walls. Luke could barely tell where his heartbeat ended and the pounding against the doors began. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but there was no time for that luxury. Survival demanded movement, vigilance, fire. Ash lay tucked in his makeshift nest behind the fireplace, his frail body rising and falling with shallow breaths. He was the only reason Luke hadn't abandoned the fight hours ago. He wasn't just guarding the cabin anymore. He was guarding the flickering pulse of something pure, something he'd thought long dead inside himself. The box of road flares was nearly empty. Luke lit another and hurled it through a cracked window. A burst of red light scattered the wolves temporarily, their yelps splitting the night. But it was a fleeting victory. They regrouped in the shadows, smarter, hungrier. Luke knew it wouldn't be long before they made a real push. And Luke was running on fumes. Blood seeping from a gash on his forearm where a splintered board had caught him, vision blurring at the edges. The fire in the hearth roared, fed by desperation, but it wasn't enough to drive back the fear gnawing at him. Just as his knees threatened to buckle, a sound cut through the chaos, a soft, ragged mule. Luke whipped around to see Ash struggling to stand. The cub's legs wobbled, but he planted his paws stubbornly, eyes locked onto Luke with a determination so fierce it knocked the breath from his lungs. Ash wasn't giving up. Not after everything. Not now. A bitter laugh broke from Luke's chest, half sob, half battle cry. If this tiny creature could dig deep and fight, so could he. With renewed fire, Luke grabbed the last 2 flares and jammed them into the broken window frames, flooding the front of the cabin in searing light. He piled more firewood into the hearth until the flames licked hungrily at the chimney. Heat slammed against the walls, filling the room with the thick, smoky scent of burning pine. A primal warning shot into the night. The wolves hesitated. Luke could feel them warring with instinct, hunger versus survival. The flare light painted them in hellish colors, teeth flashing like broken glass. One lunged at the back door, but the reinforcement Luke had thrown together just minutes earlier held. Barely. Another wolf paced at the side, whining in frustration. Then, from somewhere deep within the pack, a low, rumbling growl echoed, a signal, a leader's call to fall back. The pressure against the cabin eased. Shadows slipped back into the forest, tails low, bodies sagging with defeat. It wasn't triumph Luke felt as he sank to his knees, exhausted. It was something messier, raw. Relief, yes, but stitched with grief and anger and a fierce, desperate gratitude that left his hands shaking. Ash, still swaying on his paws, made a weak, determined stumble toward Luke. The cub pressed his tiny, battered body against Luke's knee, letting out a sound so small, so brave, it broke something open inside the old ranger. Luke scooped him up, cradling him close. The cabin crackled and popped around them, the fire fighting the cold just as they had fought off the night. And for the first time in years, Luke allowed himself to believe in something better. Not in fairy tales or second chances handed out like candy, but in survival, in stubbornness, in the power of a broken heart finding something worth beating for again. Outside, the first pale hints of dawn began to seep over the horizon, washing the wreckage in a soft, forgiving light. They had made it, scarred, shaken, forever changed, but they had made it. The days that followed were slow, quiet, and stitched together with moments so small, so fragile, they felt almost sacred. Luke moved like a man learning to live again, every task deliberate, every breath carrying a weight he was only now learning to set down. Outside, the snow melted in sluggish streams, carving paths through the battered landscape the storm had left behind. But inside the cabin, something far more stubborn was thawing. Ash stayed close, too close, sometimes, curling at Luke's feet, brushing against his leg, whimpering if he left the room for even a moment too long. The little cub's body was healing, his gait still uneven but stronger by the day. Yet it was the trust in Ash's wide amber eyes that undid Luke more than anything else. That unshakable belief that Luke was safe, that he was worth trusting. Mornings became rituals of survival and rebuilding. Luke would stir the fire, brew thick, black coffee, and sit on the back step of the cabin with Ash tucked beside him, watching the mist peel off the trees like ghosts letting go. Some mornings, Luke would catch himself talking about nothing and everything, telling Ash stories about Ethan, about the trails they used to hike, the nights spent under stars, the dumb jokes they made about the coyotes that sang them to sleep. And Ash, small and patient, would listen the way no human ever had, with a solemnness that made Luke's heart ache and heal all at once. One afternoon, Luke dug through the old trunk he hadn't opened in a decade. Inside was the wooden locket, carved by hand, the kind of thing a grieving father makes when words are no longer enough. It had been meant for Ethan's birthday, a gift he never got to give. Luke traced the carving with a trembling finger, the memories cutting sharp and deep, but this time, they didn't slice him open. They reminded him he had survived. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer and sat at the table, Ash curled beside his boots. With slow, deliberate strokes, Luke carved a small paw print into the back of the locket, a new memory to live beside the old. Not to erase it, to add to it, because healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant making space for something new. Outside, the woods felt different too, less like a threat, more like a promise. Ash's instincts started calling him more and more. The cub would stare at the tree line for long minutes, nose twitching, muscles vibrating with a wildness Luke couldn't cage. He knew what was coming. He had always known. You could save something wild, but you couldn't chain it. Real love meant letting go, even when every part of you wanted to hold on tighter. That night, as the stars pricked holes in the velvet sky, Luke sat by the fire with Ash nestled against his side. The air was thick with unspoken truths, with the bittersweet ache of a goodbye neither of them was ready to say aloud. Luke ruffled the cub's fur gently, smiling through the tightness in his throat. "You're stronger than me, little guy," he said. "Always were." Ash purred, a soft, rattling sound that vibrated against Luke's ribs. Tomorrow, Luke would take him deep into the valley. Tomorrow, he would set him free. But tonight, they simply sat together, two broken, mended souls wrapped in the warmth of a bond that had survived storms, blood, and grief. Tomorrow would hurt. Tonight was enough. The morning sky broke open in soft hues of gold and blue, spilling light across the valley like a silent blessing. Luke stood at the edge of the clearing, the old canvas satchel slung over his shoulder, Ash nestled carefully inside. The cub's head poked out, wide-eyed, alert, nose twitching at scents that spoke of freedom, of wildness calling him home. Luke shifted his weight awkwardly, every step toward the tree-line feeling heavier than the last. It was a short hike to the valley, the same valley where Luke had once taught Ethan how to track deer prints in the mud, how to tell the age of a tree by its rings, how to sit so still that even the shyest birds would land close. Those memories clung to the path like morning mist, soft but inescapable. Luke didn't try to shake them off this time. He carried them with him, step by step, letting them walk alongside him instead of weighing him down. When they reached the center of the clearing, Luke knelt and carefully set the satchel down. Ash climbed out unsteadily, paws sinking slightly into the damp earth. The cub looked back at Luke, uncertain. His small body caught between two worlds, the safety of the only home he'd ever known, and the wilderness etched into his blood. Luke swallowed against the lump rising in his throat. "This is your place now, little guy," he said, voice rough with unshed tears. "You were never meant to stay locked away with an old man like me." Ash took a few tentative steps forward, ears swiveling to catch the chorus of the forest, the chirp of hidden birds, the whisper of wind in the pine needles, the distant rush of a thawing creek. It was an orchestra of life, and it was calling him. Still, the cub hesitated. He turned, pacing back to Luke, pressing his small body against Luke's leg in a gesture so trusting, so raw, that Luke had to clench his fists to keep from scooping him up and running back to the cabin. But love wasn't about keeping. It was about giving. even when it hurt like hell. Luke reached into his jacket and pulled out the locket. He pressed it into the earth at the base of a nearby tree. A marker, a memory, a silent promise that neither of them would forget this place or what it had meant. Ash watched, his head tilted, as if memorizing every move. The moment stretched, bittersweet and sharp. And then, with a suddenness that stole Luke's breath, Ash bolted forward. Not in fear, not in panic, but in joy, in freedom. His small form darted through the underbrush, weaving between saplings, kicking up soft sprays of earth. At the edge of the forest, Ash paused. He turned, locking eyes with Luke one last time. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a thank you. Luke stood there long after Ash disappeared into the trees, the sounds of the forest swallowing him whole. The emptiness that rushed in didn't feel like loss, felt like peace, like a chapter closing the way it was always meant to. The sun climbed higher, bathing the valley in a warm, golden light. Luke tipped his head back and closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. He didn't need to chase after the past anymore. He didn't need to carry the weight of guilt like armor. For the first time in years, he could just be. He turned toward home. Not the cabin, not the battered shell of a life he'd once clung to, but something new. Something built out of scars and second chances and the fierce, stubborn kind of hope that refuses to die. And somewhere deep in the woods, a young bobcat cub ran free, his tiny heart carrying a piece of Luke's with him, stitched together with the threads of survival, loyalty, and a bond that neither time nor distance could ever erase.